We are following a new round of bombshell leaked recordings involving House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy. In the audio recorded just days after the January 6th Capitol attack and released by the authors of the new book, This Will Not Pass, McCarthy tells colleagues he's worried some House Republicans were endangering others.
Tension is too high. The country is too crazy. I do not want to look back and think we caused something or we missed something and someone got hurt.
McCarthy also called out several fellow House Republicans for their behavior, including Mo Brooks, Matt Gaetz, and Louis Gohmert in these recordings. Scott MacFarlane joins us now from Capitol Hill with reaction to all of this. Scott, McCarthy addressed the leak calls in a private House Republican meeting yesterday. What was the tone of his message, and how are House Republicans reacting to all this?
Well, Errol, the Republican leader called for unity among his members, and a lot of his supporters in the House Republican Conference called those audio tapes a distraction. But the political problem for Kevin McCarthy is those audio tapes reveal him being critical of people inside his own party, people from whom he'll need votes to remain the leader, and if Republicans take control of the U.S. House, to be the Speaker of the House. Kevin McCarthy, in the audio, says, among other things, that the country is too crazy. I don't want to look back and think we caused something or missed something and that someone got hurt. I don't want to play politics with any of that. A message about his concern that some other Republicans were putting in jeopardy fellow colleagues with their rhetoric. He also said this is serious stuff people are doing that has to stop. We saw what people would do at the Capitol, and these people come prepared with rope and everything else. This audio recording made January 10th, 2021, days after the Capitol riot. What's more, he named names, specifically criticizing Alabama Congressman Mo Brooks, who spoke at the White House Ellipse before Donald Trump on January 6th, and Matt Gaetz of Florida, the firebrand congressman who's long been critical of Kevin McCarthy. We spoke with Mr. Gaetz after meeting of the House Republican Conference yesterday, and he said he doesn't support Kevin McCarthy any more or any less than he previously did because of these audio tapes. Kevin McCarthy is taking some heat from the extremes in his party because of this audio, from Congressman Gaetz and also from Adam Kinzinger of Illinois, a member of the House January 6th committee, who's long been critical of McCarthy for his response to January 6th. But it appears, Errol, in the middle of his conference, he retained support, and at one point yesterday, from his colleagues on the Republican side, he got a standing ovation.
Okay, then. So the January 6th House Committee is actually going to decide this week whether or not they want to call him for an interview voluntarily, not subpoena him or anything like that. He's denied the panel's previous requests, but of course that was before all this audio was leaked, so I don't know if that would make a difference. Do we have any indication as to whether or not he would agree to a voluntary interview? And sort of, I imagine there's a range of things I want to talk to him about, but give me sort of the top three.
Yeah, there's a real important distinction there, Anne-Marie, between a voluntary interview and a subpoena. The House January 6th committee has been clear. They want to talk to Kevin McCarthy. They want to talk to some of his colleagues who may have had Donald Trump's ear in the hours and days before January 6th. They want to know what Donald Trump was hearing and what Donald Trump was saying. They also believe that some members of the House Republican Conference were part of the planning of how to block that electoral college count January 6th. In fact, the committee's already released text messages from some House Republicans specifically instructing the White House as how to block the electoral college count. So they want to talk to Kevin McCarthy. They want to talk to some of his colleagues, but it's a difficult thing to require one of your colleagues to appear before a congressional committee. It's just not that easy. And at this point, some of these Republicans don't see an incentive or a reason to cooperate with a committee that they are painting as overtly political and politicized. So the impasse will continue, although the chairman of the House January 6th committee, Anne-Marie, said again this week that he is going to renew his invitation to Kevin McCarthy.
And Scott, the January 6th panel, meanwhile, is taking additional steps in its legal battle with former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. You speak about this challenge in getting cooperation from within the GOP, but how then are they working to expedite this case?
They very much want to talk to Mark Meadows, perhaps more than anybody else, that they've been trying to get depositions from and subpoenas from so far. They went to court. Actually, Mark Meadows went to court to try to block the handover of some of his text messages and the required deposition with the committee. Now, the committee's gone to court to ask the judge to speed things up, that they want to talk to Mark Meadows soon, come to a ruling, come to a decision. We need to hear from this man. And part of their argument, Errol, is that time is running out. This committee knows it's got a firm deadline. They have to get this done before Election Day, with the possibility Republicans take control of the House and get rid of this committee. So they'd like hearings in court, briefings in court within the next few weeks to expedite this. They've already released some of the text messages Mark Meadows voluntarily handed over. And there are some striking things, including some of the messages he was getting from Donald Trump Jr. and Sean Hannity, and the planning ahead of January 6th to block the Electoral College count. What messages does Mark Meadows still have if the things he voluntarily handed over had revelatory and striking details? The committee wants them. They want to talk to Mark Meadows, but this is another impasse they're facing.
Before we let you go, got to ask you about Rudy Giuliani, and that he may be appearing before the committee next month. I was sort of surprised to learn that there have been ongoing negotiations to have him speak to the panel. But I imagine there's some sort of messy bits like attorney-client privilege and that sort of thing. So what sort of protections will Trump's former lawyer be seeking if he does agree to testify?
I should say first, Anne-Marie, that his attorney declines to comment on those reports that Rudy Giuliani will appear and will speak with this committee. But this is not a fellow member of Congress. This is somebody the committee has subpoenaed and is requiring testimony from. And at this point, Rudy Giuliani has defied the subpoenas. There's ongoing negotiations here about what type of interview can he sit for? What type of interview will he sit for? Will he appear virtually versus in person to avoid the cameras capturing images of him walking into the building? He's going to likely argue that he was representing Donald Trump, so some privilege applies. But the committee wants to talk to him as well. But there's another dynamic here. They need to finish this up eventually, if not soon. And they're continuing to do intake, and they still want big interviews. The clock is ticking. There are complications on several different levels.
Yeah, that's probably an understatement. Scott, thank you very much.